Oh, hey. Hi, how you doing? Thanks for coming on by today. I'm Joe Van Cleave, and I've invited you to come on by so we can talk about shooting with paper negatives, and especially how to make them work a little bit better for you. So paper negatives are a black and white photographic emulsion that's coated onto a white paper base. It is silver gelatin print paper used as film. The emulsion has a sensitivity to mainly UV and blue light with a little bit of green, and therefore the tonal range is very much like a 19th century type of image. There's two different kinds of emulsions in general. There's multi-grade and there's graded paper. I prefer to shoot with graded paper, and I use grade 2. And the reason why I do this is because I have control over the contrast. Multi-grade paper, the contrast changes with the color of the light. Daylight scenes are what I usually shoot in, and daylight is predominantly blue, and blue activates the high contrast part of the multi-grade emulsion. So I've chosen to use resin-coated grade 2 paper as my negative material. But I still have problems in harsh lighting with excessive contrast. And so what I've found works good is a technique called pre-flashing. Pre-flashing is when you're giving a base exposure, a faint exposure of light to the paper before loading it into sheet film holders or the camera. And what this does is, if you were to develop the paper right at that point without any additional camera exposure, it would be a very faint shade of gray right below paper white. And this is going to help bring up the shadow details without significantly increasing the exposure of the highlights. The reason why this happens is because the zone system grayscale of black and white paper is logarithmic. So adding a little bit of tone to the shadows hardly makes any difference at all to the highlights. So I'm going to show you some of the various aspects now of pre-flashing and using paper negatives. I'm in my darkroom, and this right here, this light bulb, is the type of light bulb that I'm using in my pre-flashing light source. This is the Gray Lab timer that I use for my pre-flashing light source. But hanging off of the top of the 4x5 enlarger is this power cord, which comes from the Gray Lab. It's looped around the top frame of the enlarger, and it's basically a metal soup can or a sauce can. The generic number is a type S11 bulb, and what this is 7.5 watts, a round globe, frosted white, that's about the size of maybe a ping pong ball, and it has a standard household AC receptacle. And what I've done with it is I've turned it into a light housing, if you will, for that light bulb. And the way this works is I'm using spare bits and pieces. This is a plastic plumbing fitting that goes maybe on a sink drain. There's a disc of heavy paper with a hole that's about, I would say, 3 or 4 millimeters in diameter. And that's basically the light source. And what's inside that can is, again, this type S11 7.5 watt light bulb. And it projects light down onto the work surface of the darkroom. But I can lay sheets of paper out on here, and I can pre-flash them. So that's my simple pre-flashing setup. Now, regarding the placement of the pre-flashing light source. As you know, the further away from your paper, the dimmer the light's going to be relative to the exposure, and you're going to need a longer exposure time. So when you set up your pre-flashing light source above the work surface in your darkroom, you're going to want to establish a standard distance so that the process is consistent. And in my particular setup, I've chosen 30 inches above my work surface is the prescribed distance for my pre-flashing light source to be suspended. So that's what you want to do, a constant distance so everything is repeatable. Okay, so a lot has been talked about on the internet and discussion forums about pre-flashing and what's the right amount of time to give pre-flashing. This is a test exposure sheet. This is using Arista brand, which is Freestyle's house brand of resin-coated grade 2 paper that is my standard paper negative material. This was pre-flashed by the light source I just showed you, suspended 30 inches above the darkroom work surface. I have 4 pre-flash exposure times. The first one is 5 seconds, and it's this circle right here. You can barely see any gray there. It's very hard to distinguish, probably impossible on camera. The next time was 10 seconds, which you can see a visible grayness, then 15 seconds, and finally 20. For this particular paper, I have decided on a pre-flash time of 8 seconds, so it's roughly halfway between the 5 and the 10. So my pre-flashing method is that the minimal amount of exposure that the negative has is going to be darker than paper white. And the reason why I want that is so I can try to capture all of the shadow detail that I can in the image. Okay, I wanted to show you one other example of using grade 2 paper negatives and the resulting contact print. What you're seeing right here is the actual negative itself. And I'm going to contrast the tone of it with the back of another sheet of photo paper, but you can see that my lightest exposure in the paper negative is much grayer than paper white. See, even along the edge of the film, along the rebate there, it's grayer than paper white. That's okay, because I've captured this subtle shadow detail, as you'll see in the resulting positive contact print, and the highlights aren't too bad. I have a few blown out highlights right along the top edge of this paperback publication, as you'll see what the final image is. But this is one of my regular paper negatives. And this is the resulting contact print. I'm going to try to focus this lens for you and try to keep the glare off too bad from hitting. I'm going to angle it slightly, but this is the contact print onto luster finish Ilford RC paper from a grade 2 Arista paper negative. When you're contact printing a paper negative, and if you were looking at it from the perspective of the positive print paper that's been sandwiched onto the paper negative, the paper negative would be backlit, and you'd be looking at the emulsion side or the front side of the paper negative. So I'm going to set this down onto the light table, but you can see here that even the dense parts of the negative, like over here and over along here, get backside illumination through the backside of the paper. And the shadow detail, like along these seed pods, along the edge of them, still has some degree of detail in it. So that's what the print paper is going to see when you're contact printing from a paper negative. Okay, I was just wanting to show you several images that I've made using paper negatives. And what I'm going to show you now are contact prints onto resin-coated, semi-matte finished Ilford paper, contact printed from grade 2 Arista paper negatives. This first one here is an image taken down in the North Valley of Albuquerque of an old home, and you can see that there's almost no detail in the window. There's a little bit of shadow detail. You'll notice the sky is basically totally blown out to white. That's the typical look of paper negatives, at what I call the 19th century look. This next image was taken out on the southwest mesa of Albuquerque. This is a row of power lines and a cross, a makeshift cross. This was taken on kind of a cloudy day, but again, the sky has essentially no detail. There's a little bit of tone in there in the sky, kind of an interesting texture almost, but this again is taken with an 8x10 homemade box camera. I think I'm using a glass lens on this, like a meniscus lens. Anyways, it's a grade 2 paper negative. This particular image here I think this is Pinhole, just a still life setting, a typewriter and different deals. But again, this is taken with RC grade 2 paper and contact printed. And then here is a landscape image taken up in the foothills of the Sandia Mountains. And this particular image, again, was exposed onto RC grade 2 paper negatives, contact printed, and you can see the sky has that orthochromatic look. And but it's a very nice tonal range. If I can manually focus this lens to show you that the tonal range is quite nice. The shadows in the nook of that boulder look quite nice. The highlights, other than the sky itself, highlights are pretty good, and it's pretty much a full tonal range. So that's an example of some images taken with paper negatives and contact printed.